Night in late summer does not fall on Gaul the way it falls on Rome. It gathers like a cloak shaken out in the dark, heavy with the damp breath of rivers and the sour smoke of peat fires, and it settles into hollows where men and cattle have always slept too close together. In those hollows, under that cloak, a rumour moves faster than any horse. Caesar is coming again. Caesar who writes and counts and measures. Caesar who smiles as if friendship were a weapon. Caesar who can turn winter into marching weather and hunger into discipline. Caesar who has already made the names of tribes sound like items in an inventory. Yet the rumour is not only of Caesar, it is also of a man who has learned to speak in the cadence of the old gods and the new fear, a king made by emergency and by hatred, Vercingetorix of the Arverni. His hair long in the way of high-born warriors, his jaw clenched in the way of a man who has begun to hear his own name said as if it were an omen. Between those two names lies a country that has never been one country, only a quilt of oaths and grievances stitched and restitched by marriages, raids, and the price of salt. Gaul is not a blankness into which legions step. It is a commerce of rivers and paths, of markets where bronze rings pass as payment, where imported wine from Massilia and Italy has made certain chiefs fat and certain debts shameful, where a man can be rich in cattle and still borrow against next year's grain because prestige has appetite that eats tomorrow. Along the Saône and the Rhône, amphora shards glitter in the mud like broken eggshells, and each shard is evidence of a bargain. A Roman merchant with a careful smile, a Gallic noble with a thirst and a need to outshine his rival at the next feast. The old order has been bending under the weight of such bargains for a generation. Some men have learned that Rome's favour can make a household ascend faster than any raid, while others have learned that Rome's favour always comes with a ledger. The Druids, who keep the calendars and the genealogies in memory, do not write those ledgers, but they feel them in their bones. Because what is owed to Rome is owed in grain, in hostages, in obedience, and obedience is a thing the gods do not usually demand between men. Caesar has spent years turning that bending into a break, and he has done it with a patience that looks like inevitability, only after it has happened. He has crossed rivers in flood by making his soldiers build what nature refused, and when a bridge stands where none stood before, it is not merely wood and rope, it is an argument. He has taken cities with walls and reputations, and when he spares or punishes, he does it as a lesson intended to travel. He has written dispatches that are also theatre, turning his campaigns into a narrative that can be read aloud in Rome, while senators pretend to listen for the sake of the Republic, and listen in truth for the sake of their own survival. He is not merely fighting Gauls, he is fighting time and debt and rivals, and the invisible laws of Roman politics that demand victories as proof that one man deserves to be feared more than another. In Gaul, fear is older than Caesar and less abstract. A village knows the footprint of last winter's wolf and the scar of the last raid by a neighbouring clan. A mother knows how close hunger sits to the hearth when the harvest fails. A warrior knows that to be seen as weak is to invite a spear the next time a council meets. Every oath is a thread tied around the throat of someone's future. A chief may promise grain to an ally and discover that the ally's demand grows with every gesture of generosity, and a chief may accept Roman aid and discover that Roman aid arrives with Roman judges. In this year, when the days begin to shorten, the threads tighten. Vercingetorix has called councils not merely of one people, but of many, and he has spoken to the part of each man that remembers being laughed at by traders from across the sea, being ordered by interpreters, being used as a pawn in the quarrels of Rome. He has also spoken to the part of each man that hates his neighbour's pride, and he has asked them to hate Rome more than they hate each other, which is like asking fire to burn in a different direction. He is young enough that some elders still think of him as the son of Celtillus, a man killed by his own for trying to make kingship too obvious. Yet the wound of that killing has become an argument in Vercingetorix's mouth. "You killed my father for reaching too far," he can say without saying it, "so now I reach only as far as necessity demands, and necessity has the face of Caesar." He has taken power by force among the Arverni, driving out those who hesitated, and then he has offered that force outward as protection. He has promised a war that is not just a collection of raids but a system, and the word system would not be used in his tongue, yet the idea is there. Deny Caesar food, deny him shelter, deny him the comfort of an enemy who will fight by familiar rules. A Roman army can march on discipline and on pride, but it also marches on wheat and on fodder, on the backs of pack animals and the patience of allies. If you remove the wheat and burn the fodder, you make discipline chew on itself. So fires begin, not the accidental fires of hearths, but deliberate fires of granaries, and the smoke is an offering of a harsh kind. Villages that have stood for generations are emptied in a day, their thatch made tinder, their barns made torches. Men who have spent their lives adding timbers to a family hall now pull those timbers down with their own hands because Vercingetorix has ordered it, and because the fear of Roman requisition is stronger than the grief of loss. The order is not obeyed everywhere, because grief is not a soldier, and because not every chief wants to be remembered as the man who burned his own people's winter. The Bituriges beg to spare Avaricum, their great town, heavy with stores and pride, surrounded by marsh and river as if nature itself were a wall. Vercingetorix, calculating like a man who has learned from his enemy, refuses and then relents, because politics is also a kind of supply line. Caesar takes Avaricum anyway after a siege that is itself a lesson in Roman appetite, and when the slaughter happens, it is the kind that makes even allies wonder what Roman mercy means when it's exhausted. Each atrocity is a nail, and nails can build a house or a gallows. By the time the armies feel their way toward the heart of Gaul, both men have learned something about the other that they will never admit. Caesar has learned that the Gauls can coordinate when they believe coordination is salvation, and Vercingetorix has learned that Caesar's speed can unmake any plan that relies on distance as defence. There is a battle at Gergovia where Caesar tastes defeat, and the taste does not humble him so much as sharpen him, because a Roman who has never been checked begins to think he is a god, and Caesar is too practical to enjoy that illusion for long. The defeat becomes fuel for Gaulish confidence, and confidence makes men generous with promises. It also makes them careless with the cost of keeping those promises. The councils grow larger, and larger councils require more theatre. In a clearing or within the ring of a town, chiefs sit with their retinues behind them. Each retinue a display of wealth in horses, in gold torques, in imported cloaks dyed with colours that do not come from local plants. Speeches are made with hands and with pauses, because silence can be a weapon. A man who can make others wait is a man who is obeyed. The Druids, whose authority is older than any chief, watch like accountants of the sacred, making sure oaths are not lightly sworn, because an oath broken can sour the favour of the gods, and also the trust that holds a coalition together. It is decided that a supreme commander is necessary, and necessity is a word that makes even proud men accept a loss of dignity. Vercingetorix is chosen, not because all trust him, but because no one else has made himself so unavoidable. He becomes in effect the hinge on which the war swings, and hinges squeal when they bear too much weight. He orders cavalry to harry Caesar, to cut foragers, to make the Romans feel the countryside as hostile, and he orders that if a tribe wavers, hostages should be taken, not as a crude cruelty, but as a binding thread. Hostages are not new in Gaul, they are the currency of alliances, children sent to be raised among allies as living proof of good faith. Yet in this war, hostages become something harsher, not a bridge between households, but a chain, because Rome has taught everyone how effective chains can be. Young noble taken as hostage eats at another man's fire and smiles through fear, knowing that his father's choices are now measured against his own throat. Such knowledge makes loyalty heavy and also brittle. Caesar, for his part, moves like a man playing a board game where the pieces bleed. He does not merely march, he watches which tribes send envoys and which send excuses, and he rewards those who bend with favours that are really hooks. He has German cavalry in his service, men from across the Rhine whose presence in Gaul is itself a psychological weapon, because the Gauls have their own nightmares about German raids, and now those nightmares ride under Roman pay. The Roman legions are not just citizens, they are a mixture of Italians and provincials, men who have marched so long that their bodies have become instruments, hands calloused from digging as much as from killing, backs used to the weight of armour and the heavier weight of orders that cannot be questioned. For the Roman soldier, the day is a rhythm: march, build, eat, stand watch, sleep lightly, repeat. The camp is a square cut into the landscape with a ditch and rampart, as if discipline itself were geometry. Each man knows his place in the line and the place of his tent, and that knowledge is a kind of comfort, because in war comfort is rare and therefore precious. They eat grain boiled into porridge, sometimes flavoured with whatever can be stolen or bought, and they dream of the city they left or the farm that might no longer recognise them when they return. Some dream of land promised as reward, because Caesar understands that hope can be rationed like grain. Officers watch for mutiny the way a farmer watches for rot, because rot spreads under the surface before it shows. As the season turns, Vercingetorix makes a decision that will later be called desperate, though in the moment it feels like logic. He has been skirmishing, burning, withdrawing, keeping his main force intact, because to risk it in an open battle is to gamble everything on one afternoon. Yet Caesar keeps moving, keeps finding supplies, keeps compelling towns to open their gates or face siege, and the coalition begins to feel the pinch of its own strategy. Burned fields feed no one, and a people at war still must eat. The warriors who have gathered under Vercingetorix are not paid in coin like Roman soldiers. They are paid in honour and in the promise of plunder, and in the hope that victory will make the suffering meaningful. Prolong the war too long, and honour begins to look like hunger. So Vercingetorix chooses a place to make a stand, and he chooses it as if he were choosing the shape of a trap. Alesia sits high, an oppidum on a plateau, with slopes falling away on all sides, with rivers nearby, with a landscape that seems to have been made for defence. It belongs to the Mandubi, a smaller people caught between larger ones, and that fact matters, because in war the small are always the ones whose land becomes a stage. The town has walls of timber and stone in the Gallic style, beams laid like ribs, stones packed between, a method that resists fire and battering, and within those walls are storehouses and wells, and the crowded wealth of a place that has traded for years. When Vercingetorix rides into Alesia with his army, he's not merely taking shelter, he's taking the Mandubi's future and spending it on his own strategy. The plateau fills with men and horses, with wagons creaking under the weight of grain and weapons, with smiths hammering repairs, with women and children looking at the swelling crowd and understanding that crowded walls can be as dangerous as enemy spears. The smell changes as it always does when too many bodies gather. Sweat, dung, smoke, the sharp tang of fear. Warriors sit in groups according to tribe because identity is a kind of shelter, and the differences among them are visible even without words. Hairstyles, shields painted with symbols, necklaces, the cut of cloaks, the tattoos some wear like promises. The Arverni are proud, the Aedui, Rome's former allies now wavering, are cautious. The Sequani remember old rivalries, and above them all, Vercingetorix tries to hold the coalition like a fist. He sends out cavalry at night, ordering them to slip through Roman movements and carry word to the tribes. Gather a relief army, come to break the siege that will surely come quickly, because time will be measured in mouths to feed. When Caesar's scouts see the mass at Alesia, he does not hesitate, not because he is reckless, but because he understands narrative. Alesia is a chance to end the war in a single dramatic act, and Caesar has always been a man who knows that Rome rewards drama, yet he also knows that Alesia is dangerous because to besiege it is to put his own army in a fixed position, vulnerable to relief forces. A Roman commander who is surrounded becomes a proverb. Caesar decides nonetheless to surround the surrounded because his confidence is built not on luck, but on earthworks, on the Roman talent for turning labour into advantage. The legions begin to dig as if they are digging their own grave and insisting it will become someone else's. The first line is a circumvallation, a wall and ditch facing inward toward Alesia, meant to keep Vercingetorix in. The second will be a contravallation facing outward, meant to keep the relief army out. Between these lines will be a landscape of traps, pits, stakes and man-made obstacles that will make any assault bleed. The work begins with the same methodical brutality that marks everything Rome does in war: measurement, assignment, repetition. Officers walk with rods and cords, marking where the ditch should run, where the rampart should rise. Soldiers strip turf, cut sod, shovel earth, carry baskets of dirt until their shoulders burn. Trees are felled for palisades, and the sound of axes becomes a drumbeat that echoes against the slopes of Alesia, a sound that tells the Gauls within the walls that the enemy is not tiring, that the enemy is building patience out of soil. In the Roman camps, the talk is of engineering and of home, but also of the Gauls' numbers, because the sight of the oppidum crowded with warriors is unnerving, even to men trained to face fear by pretending it is irrelevant. Caesar walks the line, not always in armour, sometimes in the plain cloak of a commander, and when he speaks it is often in short, practical phrases, because he knows that the men's imagination is the true enemy. He promises rewards, he threatens punishment, he makes jokes at moments when joking seems obscene, because a laugh is a way to claim mastery over dread. The centurions, hard men with scarred faces, enforce the rhythm, dig faster, raise the rampart higher, sharpen the stakes, because if the relief army comes and the works are incomplete, the price will be paid in Roman blood. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watches the ring tighten. He understands earthworks. Gauls have their own fortifications, their own sense of terrain, and he knows what it means when the Romans dig not just a ditch but multiple lines, when they do not merely block a gate but reshape the entire countryside. He orders sorties, sudden attacks meant to disrupt the work, and Roman soldiers who have been digging all day must fight at the end of their shift, must stand in formation with blistered hands. There are clashes on the slopes, javelins thrown, arrows loosed, the sound of metal on wood, the screams of wounded men sliding down the hill and leaving dark trails in the grass. Yet each sortie is met with Roman order, and order is a wall that does not burn. Caesar's engineers and soldiers add complications that feel almost sadistic in their imagination. They dig pits and plant sharpened stakes in them, covering them with brush so that a charging man will step and suddenly be impaled. They set rows of hooked branches, caltrops of iron, obstacles that will snag feet and horses. These are not weapons in the heroic sense. They are weapons for men who prefer to win by making the enemy's courage irrelevant. A Gallic warrior who has been taught to seek glory in close combat finds himself bleeding because the ground itself has become an enemy. As days pass, the circumference of the Roman works grows into a man-made horizon. From the walls of Alesia, one can see the glitter of Roman helmets, the movement of men like ants building a nest, the smoke of their cooking fires rising in orderly patterns. At night, Roman torches line the ramparts like a second ring of stars, and within Alesia the darkness feels more crowded. The Mandubii, whose town has become a fortress for others, begin to realise that the war's arithmetic is indifferent to hospitality. Each mouth inside the walls is a mouth that must be fed from finite stores. Warriors eat more than farmers, and horses eat more than men, and horses are both wealth and weapon. The grain stores shrink. The mood tightens. Men who have never been trapped begin to pace like wolves in a pen. Vercingetorix maintains discipline with the tools available to him: speeches, rituals, punishments. He holds councils, listening to chiefs who argue about whether to attempt a breakout, whether to risk a pitched battle on the slopes, whether to wait for the relief army. He cannot admit doubt because doubt is contagious, and in a siege contagion can be deadlier than swords. He orders rationing, and rationing transforms social relations. A noble who once could demand the best cut of meat now waits in line like a common warrior, and the humiliation tastes worse than the thin stew. Yet hierarchy does not vanish. It becomes more visible in small cruelties, in who gets an extra handful of grain, in who has access to a private store hidden under a floor. Such hidden stores become secrets that could ignite violence if revealed, so men guard their secrets as fiercely as they guard the walls. Outside, Caesar's supply situation is not comfortable either. A siege requires constant feeding of the besiegers, and the countryside has been burned and stripped. Caesar must rely on convoys, on allies, on foraging parties that risk ambush. He sends requisition orders to tribes that still claim friendship, and those orders are not requests. Grain is gathered from far, cattle are driven to the camps, wagons creak under the weight of necessity. Each convoy is a thread, and threads can be cut. Gaulish cavalry harass the edges, and German cavalry hired by Caesar counters them, leading to swirling fights where the ground is churned into mud and the air fills with dust and curses in multiple tongues. The relief army is not a single thing, but a promise that must become flesh. Across Gaul, messengers arrive breathless, their horses lathered, bearing Vercingetorix' call. Tribes argue in councils. Should we risk everything for him? Should we send warriors and strip our own lands of defenders? Should we trust a man whose power was seized by force? Should we let Rome pick us off one by one if we do not act? Pride answers yes more often than caution would like, because no chief wants to be remembered as the man who refused when Gaul might have been freed. Warriors gather, sharpening swords, mending shields, saying goodbye in the way men do when they do not want to admit they might never return. Mothers tie amulets to their sons' wrists. Lovers exchange tokens. Druids watch the flight of birds and the pattern of smoke and speak in riddles that can be interpreted as hope. The relief host that eventually forms is enormous by the standards of the region, a many-headed beast made of contingents who do not speak the same dialects and do not share the same gods in the same way, yet share a hatred sharpened by the image of Alesia's ring. They march with wagons and herds, with banners, with the noise of thousands of feet, and the countryside trembles under their approach. Scouts report to Caesar that a vast army is coming, and Caesar does not panic, he accelerates. The contravallation is strengthened, the outward-facing ditch deepened, the rampart raised, towers built at intervals so that missiles can be launched from height. Caesar's men, already exhausted from the weeks of labour, dig again, because the only alternative is to die. Inside Alesia, the first sign of the relief army is not its sight, but the change in Roman behaviour. More watchfires, more patrols, the tension of men who have heard footsteps in the dark. Vercingetorix sends signals, fires on the hilltops, horns at night, anything that might communicate with the allies beyond the ring. Communication in a siege becomes a kind of magic. A torch waved in a pattern can mean hope, can mean despair, can mean nothing if misread. A messenger might slip through a gap and never be seen again, swallowed by Roman patrols, and his failure becomes a silence that gnaws. The Mandubi now face a grim calculus. Their own people, the non-combatants, consume food that warriors insist they need. In normal times, a community takes pride in feeding guests and protecting the weak, because to do otherwise would anger gods and shame ancestors. In the logic of siege, shame competes with survival. Some suggest expelling the Mandubi women and children, pushing them out of the gate so that they will not consume the town's stores, hoping perhaps that the Romans will take them in, feed them, or allow them to pass. The suggestion is monstrous and also rational in the way that war makes rationality monstrous. Vercingetorix, tasked with holding the coalition together, yields to the pressure of necessity and the gates open not for a charge but for an expulsion. A line of civilians emerges carrying bundles leading toddlers, old men leaning on sticks, faces grey with fear and humiliation. They move toward the Roman lines not with weapons but with the posture of people who have been told they are no longer part of the equation. From the Roman ramparts, soldiers watch them approach, and pity rises like a throat sickness, because many Roman soldiers are farmers and fathers too, men who understand hunger's face. Caesar is informed, and he makes a decision that is as cold as it is effective. He will not let them through, and he will not feed them. To feed them would be to encourage Vercingetorix to expel more mouths, to turn the Roman camp into a burdened refuge. To let them pass would be to allow potential messengers and to relieve Alesia's stores, so the civilians are trapped between walls, in the no man's land of ditches and stakes, where no hearth can be built and no field can be harvested. They beg, they cry, they stretch their hands toward the Romans, they turn back to Alesia and plead to be taken in again. The Gauls on the walls look down and feel shame, but shame does not fill bellies. The gates remain closed, because if they open, the expelled will rush back and consume what little is left. Days pass. The trapped civilians begin to starve, and starvation has stages that are visible. First the anger, then the weakness, then the quiet. Some die in the mud, their bodies becoming part of the landscape. Their suffering is not a heroic tragedy. It is a deliberate pressure applied by both sides, and it is one of the ugliest truths of siege warfare that non-combatants become leverage. Later, men will speak of this with horror, and some will speak of it as necessary, and both will be correct in different ways, because necessity in war is a word that excuses what would otherwise be unforgivable. The relief army finally appears on the horizons beyond the Roman contravallation, a tide of men and horses and banners. The sight sends a shiver through the Roman camps, because now the Romans are the ones enclosed. Their earthworks a ring that could become a coffin. Caesar rides along the lines, visible to his men, his red cloak catching the light like a signal. He does not need to speak much, his presence is a command. Trumpets sound, units form, orders run down the chain like water down a channel. The Romans have the advantage of drilled response, of a system that turns fear into formation. The first assault by the relief army tests the Roman outer lines. Gauls rush forward in waves, shouting, shields raised, trying to fill ditches, to tear down palisades, to find weak points. Roman missile troops throw pila and shoot arrows. Slingers whip stones that crack skulls. Ballistae, crude artillery, send bolts thudding into bodies. The earthworks do what they were designed to do: slow, channel, exhaust. A warrior who wants to sprint into glory finds himself stumbling over hidden stakes, clawing at a ditch wall while arrows fall. The Romans fight from behind cover, a style of war that feels cowardly to some Gauls, and feels like wisdom to Romans, because the Roman concept of virtues includes endurance and obedience as much as bravery. The relief assault falters, bodies pile, the Gauls withdraw to regroup, and the Romans repair damage in the night, because repair is as much a part of their warfare as attack. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix listens for the sounds beyond the ring, the distant roar of battle, the intermittent cries. He times his own sorties to coincide with the relief assaults, because only synchronized pressure might crack the Roman works. He sends men out in darkness, trying to overwhelm towers, to set fires, to break through. The Romans, fighting on two fronts, become a hinge themselves, their attention split between inward and outward threats. The night is filled with confusion, with the hiss of torches, with the smell of burning wood and singed hair. Yet Roman discipline holds. When a section wavers, Caesar sends reserves. When a centurion falls, another steps into his place because the machine must keep moving. The days become a pattern of assaults, withdrawals, repairs, hunger, and mounting exhaustion. Roman soldiers sleep in snatches, their armour never far, their hands always ready for the alarm. Their feet are always dirty because earthworks mean mud, and mud means trench foot, infections, misery. Their food is stretched, their wine rationed. Gauls outside sleep in rough camps with less order, relying on enthusiasm and numbers, but numbers do not feed themselves either, and coordination among tribes is a fragile thing. Chiefs argue over tactics because each wants credit and each fears blame. The relief commanders, men whose names are less remembered than Caesar's, because history favours the victor's narrative, must persuade thousands to attack fortifications that seem to swallow courage. They probe for weaknesses, seek a point where the terrain offers advantage, where a hill approaches close to the Roman line, where the ditch is shallower, where the palisade seems less newly built. In Alesia, hunger sharpens tempers into knives. Horses are slaughtered, a sacrilege to men whose status is tied to horsemanship, yet necessity eats sacrilege. The meat is tough, and it is rationed. The smell of boiling horseflesh hangs in the air like shame. Some begin to eat dogs, then whatever can be found, roots scraped from the ground, leather softened in water. Warriors who once boasted of feasts now gnaw at bones and glare at one another. Vercingetorix moves among them, trying to keep the idea of Gaul alive, because without that idea the coalition will dissolve into individual desperation. He speaks of Rome's cruelty, of the civilians dying between walls, and he uses their suffering as a spur, because anger is a kind of food that does not nourish but keeps the body moving. Caesar watches the same suffering and reads it as progress. He's not ignorant of the cruelty, he simply weighs it against the stakes of Roman politics and his own survival. If he fails here, he will return to Rome not as a triumphant commander, but as a vulnerable man, and vulnerable men in Rome are devoured. He thinks not only of Gauls, but of senators, of rivals, of debt collectors, of the fragile legality that shields him as long as he is useful. Thus the siege becomes not merely a military operation, but a wager against the future. The relief army, learning from failed frontal assaults, plans a larger, coordinated attack on a section of the Roman outer works where the terrain offers a slight advantage, a place near a hill where the Roman line is stretched. They gather in the night, moving quietly for such a mass, and quiet is itself a sign of desperation, because Gauls prefer battle cries that announce bravery. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix is informed, and he prepares to strike inward at the same time. The plan is to force the Romans to fight on both sides at once with maximum intensity, to overwhelm reserves, to create a breach through which the relief army can pour and connect with the besieged, turning Caesar's ring into chaos. The attack begins before dawn, when the air is cold and breath is visible. Outside, Gauls surge toward the Roman contravallation, carrying ladders, bundles of brush to fill ditches, grappling hooks to tear palisades. Inside, Vercingetorix's men rush the circumvallation, their faces gaunt with hunger and fury. The Romans are jolted awake into action, horns blaring, men scrambling to their assigned points. The first moments are a blur of shadows and screams, and in that blur, small decisions matter. A centurion choosing to hold a tower rather than retreat, a soldier choosing to throw his last pilum at the right moment, a tribune choosing to commit reserves too early or too late. At the critical point of the outer line, the pressure becomes terrifying. The Gauls manage to fill sections of ditch with brush and bodies, creating a crude bridge of death. Ladders go up, men scramble, defenders stab downward, attackers pull defenders off parapets. The Roman towers, built to dominate, become points of vulnerability when swarmed. Caesar is present, riding to where the fight is thickest. Because he understands that a commander seen is a morale weapon, he orders German cavalry to strike, not directly into the fortifications but around, to disrupt the attacker's cohesion, to exploit any opening. He commits his reserves, men who have been held back for this moment, because he has been waiting for the enemy to reveal where they truly mean to break him. On the inner line, Vercingetorix's assault is ferocious, driven by starvation's madness. Men who have little left to lose throw themselves onto stakes, climb over fallen comrades, push into narrow breaches. The Romans fighting inward cannot retreat far because behind them is their camp, their supplies, their lives. The two lines become a single, continuous scream. Dust rises. The sky begins to lighten, revealing the ugliness in detail. Faces twisted, blood on wood, hands slipping on wet earth. Orders are shouted and misunderstood because sound is swallowed by chaos. There is a moment, later polished into legend, when the Roman line at the vulnerable sector bends dangerously. If it breaks, the relief army could pour in, and then the Romans would be fighting surrounded by a sea. Caesar, seeing this, makes a choice that is both tactical and theatrical. He takes personal command of a counterattack, bringing fresh cohorts in a concentrated blow against the attacker's flank. He does not do this because he is immune to fear. He does it because fear is less dangerous to him than the consequences of defeat. He knows how to use the sight of his own figure, the commander in his cloak amid the press of battle, to stiffen spines. The counterattack hits like a hammer. Roman infantry, trained to move as a unit, push in formation, shields locked, stabbing with short swords designed for close work. The Gauls, brave but less cohesive under such pressure, begin to give ground. German cavalry and Roman horsemen strike at the edges, turning withdrawal into rout in places. As the outer attackers falter, the pressure on the inner line changes, because Vercingetorix's men can sense, even without seeing, whether the relief assault is succeeding. They listen for the change in sound, for the roar of victory that does not come, and dread crawls up their throats. The relief army, having thrown itself against the Roman works, begins to waver. Warriors see leaders fall. They see the earthworks still standing. They feel exhaustion drag at their limbs. Momentum once lost is hard to regain, and in war momentum is sometimes more decisive than numbers. A retreat begins in one segment, then spreads, because fear travels faster than orders. The Romans, smelling weakness, pursue enough to turn retreat into slaughter, but not so far as to expose themselves. Caesar, careful even in triumph, restrains pursuit with discipline, because he knows that an army can win a battle and lose a war by becoming careless. Inside Alesia, the inner assault collapses as the realization spreads that the relief army has failed. Men who have been fighting with the last strength left find themselves suddenly empty. They pull back, not in order, but in a ragged flow. Some are cut down as they retreat over the same ground that has been turned into a trap. The circumvallation holds, the gates close, the oppidum becomes again a sealed pot, and now the fire under it is hunger with no promise of relief. The relief army does not vanish at once, because thousands cannot vanish, but its will breaks. Councils among the relief commanders become bitter, accusations fly, old rivalries resurface. Some contingents leave in the night, unwilling to waste more lives. By the next day, the great host begins to disperse, melting into the countryside like snow under sun, each tribe thinking now of saving its own lands from the inevitable Roman reprisals. The dream of a united Gaul, briefly made flesh, dissolves into the older reality of fragmented survival. Within Alesia, the knowledge of abandonment is a physical blow. Vercingetorix's coalition has been held together by the promise that the outside would come, that the siege was a temporary test. Now time stretches into a sentence. Food is nearly gone. The expelled civilians in the no man's land are mostly dead or dying, their bodies a grim reminder visible from the walls. The warriors look at one another not as comrades but as competitors for the last scraps. Discipline threatens to collapse into violence, and Vercingetorix, seeing the edge of that abyss, chooses a different kind of violence. He decides to surrender himself in a way that might preserve the lives of others, or at least preserve the idea that someone took responsibility. The decision is not purely noble, and not purely pragmatic, it is political even now. If he can frame surrender as sacrifice, he may preserve his legend among survivors, and legends are seeds that can sprout later. He calls a council of chiefs within Alesia, in whatever hall or open space can still serve as a meeting place amid starvation. Faces are hollow, eyes are bright with fever and anger. Arguments erupt. Fight to the last, attempt to break out, kill the wounded and charge, surrender and beg mercy, offer hostages, offer gold, offer anything. Vercingetorix listens, and then speaks with a calm that is both real and performed. He proposes that he will be given to Caesar, that the chiefs and warriors might be spared. He may also suggest handing over the Roman-friendly Aedia or other rivals, because even in defeat politics looks for scapegoats, but the core is clear. The war's symbol will be delivered to the enemy. The next day, he prepares himself. He does not dress like a man going to execution, because execution is not yet certain, but he dresses like a man staging a memory. He puts on his best armour, because to appear in rags would diminish the meaning of surrender. He mounts a horse, because to walk would look like submission in the wrong way, and he has always understood the language of symbols. The gates open, and he rides out alone or nearly alone, passing between the Roman lines that have become a corridor of power. Roman soldiers watch in silence or murmur, because they recognise drama when it rides toward them. Some feel relief, some admiration, some hatred, and all feel that history is happening in a way that will be told. Caesar sits in front of his camp, as Roman commanders do when receiving embassies, surrounded by officers, standards, the formal display of authority. He is the centre of a system that has just proven itself stronger than a coalition of tribes and the geography of a fortified hill. Vercingetorix rides up, dismounts, and in the version that will be repeated, he throws down his weapons and kneels, a gesture that is both personal and ceremonial. Whether every detail happens exactly like the later retelling matters less than the fact that both men understand the scene's usefulness. Caesar needs a defeated king for his narrative. Vercingetorix needs a dignified surrender for his. The Roman officers move forward, and chains appear, because Rome translates defeated power into metal. The surrender does not end suffering instantly. The remaining Gauls in Alesia are disarmed, sorted, and many are enslaved, parcelled out among Roman soldiers as booty, because booty is part of the contract of war. Men who fought for freedom are led away in ropes, their futures reduced to labour in fields they have never seen, in mines, in households where their language will be mocked. Chiefs may be treated differently, held for ransom or for political use. The Mandubi, whose land became the stage, are left broken, their town emptied, their people scattered. The Roman camps, once a ring of effort, begin to dismantle, because Roman victory is also an act of consumption. Wood reused, earthworks left to erode, the landscape scarred with ditches that will fill slowly with rain and bones. Vercingetorix is kept alive, not out of mercy but out of utility. Rome has a ritual for victory, and rituals require props. A defeated king in chains is a powerful prop. Caesar, already thinking beyond Gaul, will carry that prop to Rome when the time is right, to parade him in a triumph, to show citizens that the man who now seeks political dominance has tamed a wild world. The Gaulish leader, who once rode as a symbol of unity, becomes a symbol of Rome's ability to break unity. He is held for years because triumphs are timed for politics, and politics does not care about the length of a prisoner's darkness. In the meantime, Gaul does not simply lie down. Some resist, some submit, some bargain. Caesar moves with the efficiency of a man tidying the edges of a map. He punishes tribes that held out, rewards those who switched sides, enforces treaties with hostages and tribute. Roads become more Roman. Markets become more integrated into Roman trade. Coin becomes more common. Roman law seeps in like water. The Druids' authority is challenged not by direct conquest alone, but by the subtle replacement of their role in arbitration and memory. Young nobles begin to learn Latin for advantage. and each young noble who learns Latin is a thread pulled from the old tapestry. Yet beneath the surface, stories remain, because Gaul is a land of memory spoken aloud. Fires are lit in rebuilt halls, and elders speak of the year when the oppidum on the hill became the centre of the world, when the tribes gathered, when hope tasted like iron, when starvation drove people to cruelty, when Roman earthworks turned the ground into a weapon. They speak of Vercingetorix, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a fool, sometimes as a tragic necessity. They speak of Caesar as a demon of order, a man who could command dirt to become a wall. Children grow up hearing these stories, and stories shape how they interpret new taxes, new roads, new demands. Caesar, far away, will eventually cross another boundary, not of earthworks but of law, taking his army across the Rubicon and turning Rome's internal tensions into civil war. The discipline that built the siege lines at Alesia will be used against Romans, and the same talent for narrative will turn Caesar into both saviour and tyrant in the mouths of citizens. In that later conflict, men will recall Gaul as the place where Caesar learned that no obstacle is too large if you can make men dig long enough, and no enemy is too proud if you can starve him behind his own walls. Vercingetorix, carried to Rome in chains, will walk in Caesar's triumph, a living reminder that Rome's victories have faces, and then he will be executed in the ritual manner, because Rome cannot tolerate symbols that might inspire rebellion even in death. All of this, however, lies ahead of the men who dug in the mud and bled on the stakes. In the moment after the surrender, as the Roman soldiers strip armour from captives and count their shares, as the camps begin to pack and the dead are buried in shallow graves or left for scavengers, the air over Alesia is thick with the smell of sweat and smoke, and the sweetish rot of bodies that have been lying too long. Ravens circle, the sun rises and sets with indifferent beauty. A Roman soldier may find a Gallic amulet on a corpse and pocket it without understanding its meaning, and that small theft is another way cultures are swallowed. The brutality of Caesar's breaking of the Gallic king is not a single act, but a sequence of pressures applied with intelligence. The deliberate use of hunger, the refusal to allow civilians passage, the transformation of terrain into a machine, the patience to build walls not just against an enemy, but against an entire region's attempt to rescue him. It is also the brutality of forcing Vercingetorix into a choice where every path is lined with shame, to keep fighting and watch his people eat themselves, or to surrender and become a trophy. The Roman genius here is not merely military, it is psychological, because Caesar understands that to defeat a coalition you do not only kill its men, you fracture its beliefs about what is possible. In Alesia's aftermath, the survivors, those not sold or slaughtered, return to landscapes that have been burned by their own strategy and trampled by armies. Fields must be replanted with seed that may not exist. Cattle must be bred again. Roofs must be rebuilt. Graves must be dug for those who were never recovered. A man who has lost his sons in the relief army will look at Roman tax collectors later and see not bureaucracy, but the face of that loss. A woman who watched her children pushed out between walls will carry a wound that no treaty can heal. The Druids will conduct rites for the dead, speaking names so that the souls are not lost, and each name is an act of resistance against forgetting. Rome, meanwhile, will tell the story in its own way, because Rome always does. Caesar will write of Alesia as a triumph of Roman discipline, of his own foresight, of the inevitability of Roman victory. He will describe the Gauls as brave but misguided, as if their desire to resist were a misunderstanding. He will present the siege works with pride, the numbers of the enemy with emphasis, because numbers make victory look more miraculous. His account will travel, copied and recited, shaping how future generations imagine the event. Yet the mud and the hunger and the trapped civilians are harder to fit neatly into propaganda, and so they become details that flicker at the edges, known to those who were there, half known to those who heard, and often omitted by those who prefer a cleaner story. But the land remembers in its own way. Ditches fill with water and become marshy lines where certain plants grow differently. Metal lies buried, corroding slowly, a spearhead here, a nail from a palisade there, each a tooth from the mouth of war. Farmers ploughing generations later will strike something hard and curse, not knowing whose hand drove that stake or whose chest met it. The hill of Alesia will remain a place where wind feels louder, where the shape of the ground seems to echo with a past that cannot be entirely buried. And within the narrative of the people, Vercingetorix's surrender becomes a hinge too, because it marks the moment when the idea of a united Gaul was both born and killed in the same breath. Caesar did not merely capture a man, he captured a possibility, and he did it with walls that turned open country into a prison. The siege is remembered not only for its engineering but for its moral compression, the way it forced everyone, commander, warrior, civilian, into choices where every option tasted of blood. That is why the story grips and refuses to loosen, because it is not only about legions and chiefs, but about the thin line between honour and survival, and about the way a brilliant mind can use that thin line as a weapon. The Roman soldiers who survived Alesia will march again, because Rome never lets an army rest long enough to become harmless. They will carry with them habits formed in the trenches, to trust earthworks, to obey instantly, to treat the landscape as something to be shaped rather than endured. Some will boast in taverns about the great siege, exaggerating numbers, making themselves heroes in their own retellings, because men need their suffering to mean something. Others will fall silent when wine loosens their memories and the faces of starving civilians rise in the smoke of the hearth. A centurion might wake in the night for years afterward, hearing the horns of the pre-dawn assault, feeling mud under his nails. The Gauls who are enslaved will carry their own memories into Roman households and farms. A Gaulish man forced to work Italian soil will look at the neat rows and think of burned fields back home. He will speak his language quietly to fellow captives, keeping alive words that Rome does not understand, because language is a form of home that cannot be easily confiscated. Some will become assimilated, married into local populations, their children speaking Latin with a Gaulish accent, their stories diluted but not erased. In that way, even defeat migrates and changes shape. Caesar, in the months after Alesia, will continue to deal with rebellions and submission, but a core truth has been established. The greatest organised resistance has been broken, and broken resistance changes the behaviour of those who remain. Chiefs, who once might have risked defiance, now choose negotiation, because they have seen what happens to an oppidum surrounded by Roman walls. They send hostages more readily. They pay tribute. They accept Roman arbitration of disputes that once would have been settled with spears. Rome's power becomes not just military but psychological, an invisible wall in the mind. Yet the same siege that broke Vercingetorix also revealed to Rome something uncomfortable, that Gaul, when unified, is terrifying. The relief army's size, even in failure, is evidence that the land could one day rise again under different circumstances, perhaps under a leader with more time, more cohesion, more luck. Thus, Rome's policy becomes not merely conquest but prevention, encouraging divisions, rewarding some tribes against others, integrating elites into Roman patronage, because the easiest rebellion to defeat is the one that never fully forms. Caesar's successors will continue this strategy, because empire is maintained as much by managing rivalries as by garrisons. In the mind of Vercingetorix, in whatever dim cell holds him, the days will be measured not by battle, but by the slow erosion of hope. He will have time to replay decisions, the burning of villages, the stand at Alesia, the expulsion of civilians, the reliance on a relief army that failed. He might wonder whether open battle earlier would have been better, whether unity could have been built without coercion, whether his own ambition disguised itself as necessity. He might also hold on to a different thought, that he did what could be done in the narrow corridor between Rome's hunger and Gaul's fragmentation. His captors will not care about his inner reckoning, they will care that he remains alive to be displayed. That indifference is itself part of how Caesar breaks him, because to Rome he becomes an object, a future spectacle, and objecthood is a kind of death before death. The siege of Alesia is sometimes imagined as a clean ring of walls on a map, a neat diagram of engineering. But for those who lived it, it was a world of sound and smell and constant abrasion. The sound of shovels biting earth, the sound of axes, the sound of horns, the sound of hunger in the stomach at night, the smell of wet leather, of unwashed bodies packed in a town, of burning thatch far away, of blood drying on wood, the feel of cold mud between toes because sandals were not made for trench warfare, the taste of grain rationed, of water that smells of earth, of horse meat that refuses to soften, the sight of trapped civilians shrinking day by day, the sight of a commander riding along the line as if his confidence were armour for everyone else. In that sensory world, brutality is not an abstraction. It is the texture of daily life. Caesar's brutality is in his refusal to be moved by suffering, when moving would weaken his position. Vercingetorix's brutality is in his willingness to burn his own land and expel his own civilians to sustain the fight. The relief army's brutality is in the way it can march away after failing, leaving those inside to starve, because self-preservation will always speak loudly when ideals begin to die. And the deepest brutality may be the one no one chooses consciously, the way systems, Roman discipline, Gallic honour, political necessity, push individuals into actions they would have found unthinkable in peace. The story continues to move even when the fighting at Alesia ends, because consequences do not stop when swords are sheathed. Alesia becomes a reference point in conversations between Roman governors and Gallic elites, a silent threat. Remember what happened. It becomes a teaching tool for Roman officers, proof that fortification and patience can defeat numbers. It becomes a wound in Gaulish identity, a tale told at fires, sometimes with tears, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a strange pride that their ancestors once made Rome work so hard, once forced Caesar to build 2 walls and fight the world at once. And while Caesar will later be stabbed in a Roman Senate house by men who claim to defend liberty, the methods he honed in Gaul, the use of speed, the manipulation of alliances, the cold arithmetic of suffering, will outlive him, because empire is a craft passed from hand to hand. The hill of Alesia, quiet after the armies leave, will sit under changing skies, watching seasons return as if nothing happened, yet the soil will hold within it the iron and the ash of that season, when Gaul tried to become one and Rome decided it would not be allowed.